Ryan Day is the third consecutive Ohio State coach to win a national championship, and as luck would have it, that's the perfect amount of things to talk about on a Thursday on the Podcast Daily. That's Jeremy Birmingham. I am Austin Ward. This is a Three Things Thursday. Berm, is it starting to feel like the correct day of the week to you? I still feel a little disoriented after that month on the road.
I agree. I don't feel like it's Thursday yet, but it is starting to normalize. It's nice to get a little bit of getting back home and getting into a normal routine for the next 5 weeks until spring football starts, and then it starts all over again. But it's good. My wife was talking to her mother the other day about whether or not I could make it to dinner on Sunday, and her mom was like, "Are you sure he can make it?" And she said, "Yes, I have a husband again for a few weeks." So it's back to normal. It feels good to be settled in. The weather is turning. The sun is staying out later. Ohio State's national champs. What else could you ask for?
I don't know, but we're going to find out. We're going to get into some roster stuff, some coaching staff stuff. But thing number one, Berm, is just only related to Ohio State through a rivalry. What was your favorite thing that you learned in Ross Dellinger's report, which definitely didn't come directly from Michigan, in their 137-page response to the NCAA? What did you learn? What thing stood out to you?
Two things stood out. First, that the report was trying its best to, obviously, as you said, it really did feel like it was clearly handed over from the Michigan side of things, which if that's like the good news in the story, if that's the good news about their response, then I really think that maybe I've been sort of on the prepare to be underwhelmed side of the NCAA punishment thing. But if that's the best they can do, then maybe the NCAA actually does have some ability to lay some waste to the program in Ann Arbor, at least for a year or two. But the funniest thing is obviously Sharon Moore saying he deleted text because he was mad. Like, you couldn't.
How dare you try and take attention
credit
away from these players,
I mean,
Connor Stallions? I'm going to delete these texts. How dare you?
I'm deleting these texts because I'm mad that he is going to get credit for the Michigan success. Like, how did you know that he was going to get credit for the success? If whatever, the entire thing is ludicrous. 137-page report. Again, we only get a snippet of what Dellinger reported on Yahoo, but clearly that's 137 pages of going, okay, we did it, but so what? And that is wild to me. Like, that is a wild response. Like, oh yeah, well, you're overreacting. Stop it. You know what happens when you tell someone they're overreacting? Generally speaking, they react even more over. So we'll see how that plays out. I'm flabbergasted by the entire thing. I do think that you gain some respect for guys like Mike Hart when you read it, and his response when he found out that what was going on, and immediately taking it to Jesse Minter and saying, "Hey, this is going on." And of course, I mean, it never went beyond that because apparently Jesse Minter didn't want to report it to anyone else. But it makes you wonder.
Gosh, I wonder why that could be.
Yeah, hard to tell.
It's almost like the coordinators, and the further you got to the top of the food chain, the more there was for them to gain by actually having opponent signals. Who would have thought that? It's like there was a benefit to this whole scheme.
Well, sure, there was a benefit, but was it really that big of a benefit? Can you prove it? And I mean, it's 137 pages of that. That's got to be insane. That's just insane. So, well, I guess the good news is now that we can fully expect the NCAA to like respond quickly, right?
Oh, no, you definitely can't expect that because they will have hearings. And I guess Michigan is trying to coerce the whistleblower, which I thought was a pretty interesting thing that we learned, was that it was not a Illuminati scheme hatched by Ryan Day and his brother.
I get it. You're asking, but we already knew that. So like, this didn't tell me anything we didn't know.
Oh, yeah, that's true. We did know that. And anyone with a lick of sense already knew that as well. But apparently there were a number of people that were stunned by this revelation in Ann Arbor. But that's neither here nor there. I think your first point, your first takeaway is the most amusing and the most correct. If this is what Michigan is leaking, and this is the best light that they can paint it in, and their defense is, yeah, we cheated, but not as many times as you said we did. Just try that with your significant other. I mean, I hope that you don't ever have to. But if it's like, you know what, you said that I cheated on you 44 times, but it was only 8. I don't think that's going to help your cause.
And sometimes it was just on TV. I mean, whatever. It's such a ludicrous assertion from the start. Everyone who's ever played sports, we've talked about this ad nauseum for a year. Anyone who's ever competed knows the benefit that Michigan gained from that, and for them to try and downplay it as they have over the year it's just insane. I mean, there's no other word for it. It is a wild bout of arrogance that is coming from Ann Arbor when that's your response. Like, wild.
I do think that there is value to this being publicly on the record from Michigan's response that it is an in-house whistleblower, that the call came from inside Michigan. It came from inside Jim Beckler Hall, because whether Michigan was encouraging this or not to people who were covering the story, north of the border, I don't know. I can't prove that. I would have to just say, I suspect that, but I don't have any proof. It sure seemed like the tenor of the coverage was like, hey, look over there. This had to be Ryan Day. I think to publicly put that out there is significant. Whether you or me or Bill or anyone, outside of Ann Arbor already thought, well, this doesn't really make sense that Ryan Day could orchestrate or hack into Michigan's computers and start an investigation into a spying scandal. If any of that sounded ludicrous to you, or even if it didn't, I still think that the fact that it is now clearly on the record has got to be some sort of relief for Ryan Day. Not that he needs it. He now has a national championship that's probably helping him sleep better at night, but he had to go through this, and his brother and his family and all this like nonsense, and they were doxxed and people were casting aspersions on them and trying to attack them for a long time. Maybe this can relax some of that. I do think there is some value to it.
Yeah, and I think it's also valuable. And I don't know how many Michigan fans we get watching the show or whatever, but I think it's important for people who consume media to sometimes know that they're being completely lied to. Like, that's pretty relevant, I think, to know that the Michigan media was either given a load of BS and then swallowed it and regurgitated it without critical thinking, or B, knew that they were being told to lie and deflect and then did it anyway on the behest of the Michigan coaching staff and administration. I think either way, it's a pretty bad look for the people who are the Michigan insiders, because anyone with common sense knew that that's what was going on 8 months ago. And they yet continued to drive this, and to not only drive it in a way that puts your professional reputation on the line, but it also puts Ryan Day and his family in jeopardy. Like, it is a security issue. There's talk about the security in Ryan Day's house and all that stuff. And like that had been going on because Michigan fans have been blaming him for the demise of their program, which is also funny. I mean, they won a national championship. You still got your title. Like, no one's going to take it away from you. So like it was very irresponsible to peddle that BS. And whether or not it was done intentionally or whether or not those media members were just being, good foot soldiers for the Michigan football program, it certainly looks bad on them that no one took a second to question whether or not there was any reason to question it. So whatever. Yeah. Not surprising.
Well, and you said, this must mean that it's going to be over soon. And unfortunately, it definitely will not, because there will still be more extensions. There will still be more billable hours. I hope, and I really thought, and maybe I was wrong, that Michigan would take a negotiated settlement, because clearly they are acknowledging that the cheating absolutely did happen. And now they're trying to, I guess, work in shades of gray between level 1 and level 2 violations. And I've been around NCAA violations. I've had to, cover them at Tennessee. Wasn't around to cover the Jim Tressel situation, but all these things play out over a longer period of time than they should, which is a reminder of how feckless the NCAA is. We definitely don't have to relitigate that. That's an absolute fact.
Yeah.
And we can move on from there to actual things.
I wonder though, how many, before we do, how many level 1 violations can you get rid of in order to make this less important, less potentially devastating for Michigan because they're 6 level 1 violations. Like, so if you lose half of them, are you comfortable then negotiating a settlement? Like, what do they have to do? Because I don't see a scenario where they can possibly lose all 6 of them.
Well, they have to try and protect the head coach that they decided to elevate. I mean, because he is a repeat offender by NCAA rules. So
Yeah.
he is the one that's under the most jeopardy. I think just looking at this objectively, it's also why they tried to explain away the deletion of the text in his level of involvement. I think more than anything, this is about Sharon Moore. I mean, Michigan as a whole would be a repeat offender, but I don't think
Yeah.
that the NCAA is going to take away the national championship. I don't think that they're going to give a death penalty to Michigan football. I don't think any of those things are going to happen. So I think quite clearly from what I've seen and what I've experienced and what I've covered in the past, this would be solely about making sure that Sharon Moore is able to continue coaching Michigan, which I frankly find to be a silly notion, but that doesn't matter here or there.
Yep. Next.
All right. Thing number 2. There were not, as we talked about earlier in the week, a ton of Ohio State players who could have declared for the NFL draft and went ahead and did so. Basically, we're talking about Quinshon Judkins here. But when you look at the grand scope of this, we start to think about the 2025 roster, Berm. And Jack Sawyer stood up there on Sunday and joked that he was going to take a 5th year. Let's just say that anyone with exhausted eligibility or who declared for the draft, if you want Quinshon Judkins, if you could keep anyone, just one, for the 2025 Ohio State roster for players who are moving on, who would it be?
Ooh, I think it might be Quinshon just because the running back room right now is so inexperienced. I really do think there's a lot of trust in James Peoples to be an every down back, but you still are behind him. You don't really have a true sense of what you get with CJ Donaldson, the West Virginia transfer yet. And then you have Sam Williams-Dixon out the door. So now you have just James Peoples, CJ Donaldson, and the 3 signees that you brought in the class of 2025, Bo Jackson, Isaiah West, and Turbo Rogers. Turbo doesn't arrive on campus until June. You have a couple walk-ons. You get guys back that were lost to injury last year from the walk-on side of things. But running back, you could certainly see a need for that, especially with an inexperienced quarterback, to give him somebody else to kind of lean on with the offense, because we think the offensive line will be pretty good. And because I can't ever just pick one, I'm going to go back to the defense, and I'm going to say Tyleik Williams, because I think that Tyleik Williams at his best is the reason that Ohio State's defensive line looked the way it did in the playoffs, and the reason that Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau were able to crank up their games so high, because Tyleik was just wreaking havoc and making himself pretty much unblockable. And when he's doing that, the entire team is way, way better.
Yeah, doing that with a high ankle sprain as well, as he told us after the national championship game. I knew you were going to take more than one. I didn't expect you to limit it, so that's fine. And I actually left somebody out accidentally, someone who could have returned and declared for the NFL draft, and they did it so long ago that it's maybe why it slipped my mind. And I think you said that you have a lot of confidence in the Ohio State offensive line, and I think there's a good reason to have that, especially with the additions that they made through the transfer portal. But what if you also still had Josh Simmons at left tackle?
That'd be good.
He's been injured so long, and he declared so early for the NFL draft. I feel like we just completely moved on. And Ohio State had no choice but to do that. They had the second half of the season to play. They had the college football playoff and 4 games to get through. And they did that because Donovan Jackson was a hero. And I think the actual MVP of this team. I've made that case a couple different times on the podcast daily, so I won't rehash all the reasons for that. But Josh Simmons is going to probably be a first-round draft pick. And if you're able to keep that on this team for another year, and then you have 4+ moving parts at guard and center, and then you were able to do some different things and actually build some depth potentially at tackle. Maybe you wouldn't have got both of those guys in Daniels and Onionwa through the portal if you had Josh Simmons coming back, but that might have been okay too if you only landed one of the two. And then you were working with depth with Ian Moore or whoever else, however that shakes out going into spring camp. But I think he's the choice. And I accidentally excluded him from the Quinshon argument, which I think maybe reinforces why
That's fair.
we needed to talk about him more.
It's fair. And part of that, if we're being honest, is on Josh. He wasn't around the program. I mean, he showed up at the Rose Bowl, but he was not on the sideline for the rest of the playoff like every other injured player was. And some of that's because, he announced for the NFL so early and was out training and doing his thing. But I do think it sort of was out of sight, out of mind for him. We saw Seth McLaughlin, being a leader of this team, even when he was incapable of playing. I definitely see the argument for Simmons as the choice there, but I was talking about it on Talking Stuff on Tuesday night. I think that there's an actual chance that the line is better next year, because of the return and the confidence of Luke Montgomery and Austin Sarabel, Tegris Shabola, Carson Hinsman. I think it's crazy to suggest that you could lose the Remington Award winner, a potential first-round pick in Josh Simmons, and a potential first-round pick in Donovan Jackson, and think that the collective line might be better. But I do think that there's a possibility of that, which sounds stupid when you say it out loud. But I do think there's a possibility if all those guys continue on the ascension that they were playing, the way they were playing at the end of the season. But Josh Simmons, clearly, his absence was felt so profoundly in the 3 or 4 weeks after he got hurt that you can't forget how valuable he was to that team.
Am I to understand you correctly that Justin Fry actually does develop offensive linemen?
And I think that point has now been well made. Now I understand where people still get frustrated, and I understand the criticisms, constructive or otherwise, about the recruiting, but it's clear when you see where Luke Montgomery is or where Austin Sarabeld is after a year plus 2 years in the program, they're ahead of the curve, and people, I think the expectation for offensive linemen is always to be so great so early, but that's never really been reality. So, what you see out of Sarabeld and Montgomery is actually ahead of the curve. So I think that has to be credited to Justin Fry, and not, but you got to give a little bit also to Tim Drevno and to Chip Kelly for what they did with that group, because it was night and day from the middle of November to the end of the season.
And defensively, since you did this, I will have to second my pick as well. Tyleik Williams is definitely the choice. I don't think there's any question about that. You can go across all 4 spots on the defensive line. It has to be a defensive lineman. Jack, JT, Ty Hamilton, or Tyleik Williams. One of those, all those guys would be valuable. I think maybe we slightly give the edge to Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson. Is this is year 4 for them. Physical development, technical development, knowledge of scheme, whatever that winds up being, which we can talk about in thing number 3. You just assume that they're going to be ahead and ready because they've been on the field, not as much as we would have expected or projected, but enough that that they're essentially proven veterans without proven statistical production. So I think then you have to just slide over to defensive tackle, and that's a spot where you want to play more than 2 or 3 guys anyway.
Yeah, and I think the only other person you could even have in the conversation on defense, if we're saying Lathan Ransom can't be in the conversation because his eligibility is long over with, it'd be Jordan Hancock, because he's just so valuable in the slot and what he can be as a deep safety. And if you could just move him back to the role Lathan Ransom played this past year for Ohio State next to Caleb Downson, that would be super sweet. But it's not happening.
It'd be borderline unfair to anybody trying to continue to maybe chip away at the silver bullets. They're going to have some work to do. They've got a bunch of pieces to replace there, and they also have to replace their defensive coordinator. So we are 5 days into this, Berm. Have your thoughts on how this should be handled, or who should be promoted, or if there must be an exterior hire? Has any of that changed over the week? That's thing number 3. Where do you land right now thinking about the defensive coordinator spot?
I'm definitely coming around to the idea of a co-defensive coordinator opportunity for Tim Walton and McRary. I don't, and I get there because I just don't think that Ohio State is in a position where they need to throw out the baby with the bathwater here. You have a lot of returning experience coming back on defense, maybe not a lot of starters, but you have a lot of experience. And I think it makes sense to hold things in a pattern that are, hey, this is what the defense has been. If you keep McRary and Tim Walton as your coordinators, one of them, you can even actually slide Guerreri into more like that football nerd schematic role that Jim Knowles was handling, and because you can then bring in somebody else to coach the safeties if you need to. and be another recruiter. I think it makes sense to me. I think that provides Ryan Day some flexibility as far as do you bring in another recruiter like a safety secondary coach? Do you bring in somebody to work alongside or replace potentially Larry Johnson? If Larry decides to leave, which is still up in the air, there's conversations that still have to happen, I think, with the entire coaching staff to make sure everyone's still on the same page for 2025. Like, you might need to bring in 2 new coaches. So there's flexibility there. And, the more I think about outside guys, I was thinking about the Jim Leonard thing specifically because he's a guy that obviously feels like it would make a lot of sense. And I wonder how much Ryan Day, when he is evaluating coordinator options, how much he thinks about, well, what did I do to that defensive coordinator when he coached against me? You know what I mean? And I think that eliminates some guys, which seems funny. But I remember, Jim Leonard's defenses against Ohio State in like 2022, 23 were not good. And I wonder if that like slowed down some potential interest from Ohio State. But it's important to have continuity. It's important to have flexibility. And I think that McArary and Tim Walton, that combination provides the most of that for Ohio State, with the provision here that Tim Walton absolutely has to continue coaching corners, because that is a major piece of the puzzle for the Ohio State defense.
Ryan Day has also had a fair amount of success against Iowa, Berm, and that's been another exterior candidate that you've talked about a number of times.
Sure, but I mean, do they score a lot of points against Iowa? Do they run the ball? I mean, they out talent Iowa so much that I don't know that it's a fair fight, but also I am certainly, as we sit here on Thursday morning, definitely of the mindset that the move is likely to be, as we started the show, from inside the house.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think we mentioned this last offseason, and I definitely felt like there needed to be more urgency on the clock with Larry Johnson. And I have said repeatedly, and will reiterate right here, after what the Rushman did in the second half of the year, he has earned the right to make this decision for himself, unequivocally, point blank, period. I think that's still ongoing as we head into the weekend. We'll see what Larry Johnson decides, but either way, there is still going to be a point when Larry Johnson is no longer able to be the best defensive line coach in America. I don't think he's able to do it forever. He's not a vampire. So you have to plan for a future without him. And I don't know if Ohio State can swing it. They definitely considered it. They definitely tried at this time a year ago. And a name that we talked about then was Jason Taylor. I don't think that that's a name right now that merits a lot of conversation. And I would go back to someone who I've talked about much more frequently. So Randall Joyner at Ole Miss has coached with Larry Johnson before. He's coached at Ohio State before. He has recruited and developed in the Southeastern Conference. He's doing it at a high level. I don't know what more he would have to prove. Now, he makes a lot of money already, and he already has a fair amount of responsibility at Ole Miss, but that would be the spot where I agree with you. I think this most likely winds up with McArary and Tim Walton as co-coordinators. And then what do you need after that? I still think that those guys should coach safeties and corners personally. I don't know if Ryan Day agrees with that or not. But if I'm looking at it in, I guess, fantasy drafting the coaching staff by next week, I think the biggest swing would be short term. If they're going to do more 3-down, multiple fronts, Randall Joyner can do different things with linebackers or edge guys, whatever. I don't know. Even if this is my fantasy Ohio State coaching staff, I don't know the right way to delegate all those responsibilities. But I think that would be the swing that I would be most in favor of Ohio State taking, because he checks every box that you could possibly want. And that gives you some short-term familiarity if Larry Johnson continues. But even if he doesn't, Randall Joyner has proven that he can coach defensive line groups as a whole.
Yeah, and again, I think your point about Larry Johnson having the ability right now to dictate the terms is true and fair, and I think it's the right way to handle things. Ohio State has been in an absolute whirlwind since they got back from Atlanta a week ago. On Wednesday, Larry Johnson was in Atlanta with Ryan Day and Tim Walton recruiting down there in the Peach State. So it's not like Larry's sitting at home smoking a cigar right now. I mean, he's still out on the road and still doing what he has to do. I think once the dead period finishes this weekend on Saturday, you're going to see some of these conversations happen. And I personally, Larry Johnson has 1 year left on his contract. If he wants to ride it out and finish this next season at Ohio State, I think the Buckeyes 100% should and will honor that and say, hey, absolutely. But I do think that there's value in saying, Larry, let's make this a retirement tour. Let's tell everyone now, like, hey, I'm retiring at the end of next year. Randall's going to be my replacement. He's going to work with us this year to make sure we have the best version of Ohio State. Because I do think that you're obviously battling egos and responsibilities and roles, and that's not easy to mesh those all the time, especially because Randall Joyner now is an established coach and is a guy that has carved his own path. He doesn't need Larry Johnson to pull him along. But I do think that there's a way to coax it to work together.
Yeah.
But again, that's a dream scenario, I think, for Ohio State. We'll see what happens in the next week or so. But Larry Johnson has great relationships with Caden Curry, Kenyatta Jackson, Edric Houston, Caden McDonald, the rest of his defensive linemen. But it is an interesting time when you lost so much that you have basically half of the room hasn't played, and so it's not quite as like tied to Larry Johnson as JT and Jack and Ty were.
Right. No, that's a fair point. Those conversations are ongoing, and the podcast daily conversations ongoing as well every single day, Monday through Friday, here on the podcast channel, YouTube, audio, however you get it. We appreciate you listening. We'll be back on Friday, and we're going to have a mailbag. That's right. It's a mailbag. I remembered what they're called in the last 24 hours. We'll put out a call for that on Subtext if you follow us along there. We'll have Bill Landis on board for that, and we'll take all your questions about the 2024 season, what it was like to cover it, head in 25 with the roster, or getting ready for the Royal Rumble. Whatever's on your mind, we'll tackle it. But this has been Three Thoughts on a Thursday edition of the Podcast Daily. He's Berm. I'm Austin. We'll talk to you tomorrow.